I think too, one of the things that we find is a lot of the couples that we meet with, one of them is really involved in the everyday budgeting. They know where the money's going. They're balancing the checkbook. And then typically the other spouse is the one that's working with an advisor or they're managing the assets. But one of the things that we find a lot is a lot of spouses are not communicating on how much money can we afford to spend in retirement. What does it look like if we start with a positive, with the market being up? What does it look like if things are down? And so one of the things that I think is big is making sure that you get on the same page with your spouse. If something were to happen to you and you're the person leading this whole thing, is your spouse going to be okay? Four of the big areas, and we can dive into each of them, that you should be talking about is Social Security. I think a lot of people think that Social Security is synonymous with retirement, meaning you retire and then you just turn it on. And they don't realize there's actually different strategies, advanced strategies, depending upon your expenses and your assets and your goals. That may determine in itself when you and your spouse take your Social Security. The second big thing is taxes. I mean, how often, Yelisey, do we sit down with a couple and we'll say, hey, you're about to retire. You're about to touch some of this money that you've spent your whole life saving, never touched it before. What is your tax strategy? What's the answer we normally get?
They don't have one.
They don't have one.
But it's hard. It's hard to have a tax strategy, and I think that, there's some history that I want to go over in just a little bit, but, that's why we contribute to a 401k. That's why we make, we defer our compensation, because the idea is in retirement, you're going to be in a lower tax bracket. And, that hasn't always been the case. Not only, could your income potentially be higher than when you were working, we see that happen from time to time, but the tax brackets could be different, right? We're the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that's expected to sunset at the end of 2025. So we're going to experience a change in our tax brackets. And I don't know too many people, Trey, maybe you do, that think it's going down, but more than likely, it's going to revert back to the way it was and potentially even higher.
Well, I think one of the comments I hear a lot is, during all my working years, Trey, my advisor said that in retirement, I'm going to be in a lower tax bracket. Yeah. And while that may be true for some people, I think a lot of the families that we serve, because they've got large pensions or because they've got a large IRA and they have higher expenses, or maybe they have multiple income streams. Maybe they have some consulting income. Maybe they have a pension. Maybe they have some real estate that's, producing some income. A lot of the families we serve are not in a lower tax bracket in retirement. A lot of them are in the same tax bracket. And so what's interesting is, almost every week I have somebody say, well, that won't be us. And then we start turning on income and we find it is them. So do you have a plan? If you're 5 to 7 years from retirement, what are some things you can do to potentially stay in a lower tax bracket? What are some of those things that you can do now?
Yeah. It's kind of an interesting shift that happens. In your working years, everyone's always underpaid, right? Everyone's complaining, hey, we don't make enough. I'm overworked. I'm underpaid. And then in retirement, everyone tries to reduce their income as much as possible. It's an interesting thing. But, when you look at the tax brackets, I just wanted to look up, during, I think this was maybe a little bit after World War II, but the highest tax bracket was 94% on anyone who made over $200,000. The marginal tax bracket, highest marginal rate. And I think, $200,000, I'm not sure how many people made $200,000 in today's dollars. That's like $2.5 million. So maybe, it's fair to say that there weren't a lot of people who paid 94%, but just knowing that the highest bracket was 94%, that's kind of crazy. It's considering today's brackets.
No, I mean, it is for sure. I think, too, most people would agree, taxes are not likely to go down. We've doubled our debt in this country just in the last 4.5 years. We went from $17.5 trillion to $35 trillion. And I think I said this in the last podcast, but for every dollar that we pay in taxes, 30 cents of that dollar goes just towards the interest on the debt, not even towards the principal. So tax strategy is important. I think what we find is most people have a tax preparer. And a tax preparer is somebody that looks back. And oftentimes we joke, they'll say, well, here's what you should have done last year, which a lot of people have heard. But what a tax advisor is it's somebody that looks forward and says, Jim and Jane, here's what you should be doing now to save taxes down the road. And we found that most families do not have a tax advisor they have a tax preparer. Yeah. The third big thing is Medicare. Yelisey, when we think about the families that we serve and the individuals that are retiring, most people don't realize that there are things to think about regarding Medicare. And a lot of people don't know there's tax traps around that. There are ways to design your income to keep it lower. Will you touch base on that for a second?
Yeah, I'll touch on Medicare in just a second. The last thing I wanted to say about taxes, it's really difficult to plan for this stuff. And I would say whatever you hear in the media, whatever you hear from the politicians, like take that with a grain of salt because, in the 1980s, they dropped the tax rate down to 28%. And all the lawmakers promised that this would be the final time that the top tax bracket would ever change, right? They said that this is the last time, this is the highest it'll ever be. It took them 3 years before that promise was broken. So probably, planning for taxes, that might be a difficult thing to navigate. More than likely, it'll change maybe more than once during your retirement. So I know that some of that is hard to mitigate. But in terms of Medicare, a lot of times people don't consider Medicare to be a tax. It doesn't show up on your 1040. Probably your CPA, whoever's helping you with your taxes, they're not covering the cost of Medicare, right? It's just not really relevant. But in our office, we often consider taxes to be any cost that increases when your income increases. So Medicare is a means-tested program. In other words, Part A, inpatient care, that's free. You don't have to pay for that as long as you qualify. But Part B comes at a premium, and it's currently $174. $174. I think it's $174.70 or something like that. Yeah, $174.70. But that's only if your adjusted gross income as a single person is less than $103,000 and $206,000 if you're married, right? If you're above those income thresholds, then you might be paying 2 or 3 times as much for your Medicare Part B premiums. And, that's a difficult thing for some people. We had someone recently who just came in, and for them this year, they're paying an extra $8,000 in Medicare premiums compared to the year before because of an event, right? A taxable event that took place 2 years ago. Medicare looks at your income 2 years before, and that's what determines your premium for this year. And by the way, according to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, about 7 to 9% of people are affected by this Medicare surcharge every single year. So about 10% of the people have to deal with it. And what we found is a lot of times it comes as a surprise. I mean, if you just think about whenever you sit down with your CPA to take care of your taxes for the previous year, how difficult it is to remember everything that happened. Well, just think, Medicare looks at it from 2 years ago. So you might not even be suspecting that your Medicare premiums are going up, but you're going to get a letter in the mail letting you know, hey, you're no longer paying $174.70. You're paying 2 or 3 times that much. So it's just something to be aware of. And then the last thing I'll say that, maybe not a direct cost, but something that a lot of times that we talk about, we deal with life insurance, long-term care, a lot of estate planning. We do a number of things. And one thing that people aren't aware of, I feel like sometimes people think that Medicare is going to cover all of their expenses related to long-term care. And that's just not the case, right? So Medicare Part A, that's inpatient care. As long as you pay your $1,600 deductible, the first 60 days of inpatient care, you don't have to pay anything. Medicare will cover the entire cost. But by the way, there's no limit to the number of times. So if you end up getting admitted to the hospital more than once, you'd have to pay that deductible each time, right? So that could happen more than once per year. But then from day 60 to day 90, you're on the hook for $408 per day of inpatient care. After day 90, you have 60 days, right? And you're on the hook for $816 per day. But the remaining days after day 90, those are lifetime usage days. So once those are gone, once those lifetime reserve days are gone, you pay the entire cost and you don't recover those days. So another thing that to be aware of, what are you doing to plan for some of those additional costs that come up? And we talk a lot about Medicare. Christine in our office who handles Medicare 9 to 5, that's her job. She offices right next to me, right? And these conversations, they go hand in hand, whether you're talking about Social Security, whether you're talking about Medicare, and just the importance of planning for all of the things that might happen in retirement, and mostly just to mitigate some of the unexpected expenses that could come up.
Absolutely. I think last under that is, life expectancy. So I read that life expectancy rates in the U.S. have basically more than doubled over the last 200 years. I kind of laugh because obviously, 200 years is a long time. But
who's tracking it 200 years ago?
Man, probably nobody, but it sounds good,
Sounds good, yeah.
But I think the biggest thing is, people outside of COVID probably are living longer than ever before. And one of the things that a lot of people are running into, specifically people in their late 70s and 80s, is they're living longer than they anticipated. And due to inflation, due to health costs, their money isn't lasting as long as they need it to. So now they're dependent on kids and grandkids, and maybe they're selling their home to kind of fund the rest of their retirement and moving with a family member. But one of the things that we do for families that we meet with and individuals is we look to say, hey, what happens if inflation does average closer to 4% than 3%? What happens if your health takes a big decline where your spouse is, and now all of a sudden, your deductible or that co-insurance ends up taking, a couple $100,000 of your retirement? Does the money still last as long as the youngest person or the survivor? And so one of the things that we can help people with is take a look to say, hey, if we do a stress test, meaning if we have inflation problems, if we have market problems early on in your retirement, if one of you lived to be in your mid to late 90s, is that person going to be okay? Can they still be independent? And so if you've never had that done before, and you want to take a good, what I would call a conservative look on, am I going to be okay? We'd be happy to do that for you. Feel free to give us a call. Our number's on the screen, or shoot us an email, and we'll do a complimentary consultation on your overall retirement plan.